Good morning. Can you all hear me? Is this on? Okay, great. My name is Missy Ryan, national security reporter with the Washington Post, and I'm really pleased to be here today with this really great group to discuss European perspectives on the evolving threat from the Islamic State. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then we're going to have about 40 or 45 minutes of moderated Q&A, and then you in the audience will be able to ask your questions. I'm sure there'll be a lot of good questions from the group here. So first to my left, we have Carla Thomas, who's the head of Middle East and North Africa at the British Embassy in Washington. Then we have Quentin Lopino, Counselor for Strategic Affairs at the French Embassy, and Konrad Mueller, First Secretary for Middle East and North Africa at the German Embassy. So I'm going to start things off with a question about Islamic State prisoners and detainees, building off of the earlier conversations that you all have had. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the sort of larger strategic picture for Iraq and Syria and beyond. So first, I'd like each of the panelists to tell me a little bit about their country's role in support for maintaining the detainee and ISIS family population in Iraq and Syria, and what your country is doing to either transfer or repatriate those individuals. So maybe we'll start with you, Carla.
Sure. So it's lovely to see you all here in person once again. It's great that we've got Brits able to come over to the US after being held apart by COVID. I mean, in terms of what the UK is doing on this issue, I mean, we are a leading member of the Global Coalition to Counter Daesh. We're active across all 5 lines of effort, including on foreign terrorist fighters. And, you know, on foreign terrorist fighters, we've been very clear we want to see them brought to justice, whatever their nationality, in the most appropriate jurisdiction, which we think will often be in the region because that's where the crimes were committed. We have also repatriated some of our nationals. So we made a decision in 2019 to repatriate orphans and unaccompanied minors, and we have done that on several missions since. I actually went on the first of those missions to kind of bring a small group of children back from Syria. So, you know, I speak from personal experience about just how complex and challenging those missions are to execute. But, you know, we also play an important role in kind of trying to improve the security and humanitarian situation in northeast Syria and in Al-Hol in particular. You know, I just emphasize here that actually the majority of people in the IDP camps in particular are not third country nationals, they're Syrians and Iraqis. And, you know, many of those Syrians are going to be people who have come from regime-held areas and other parts of Syria where it's not necessarily safe to return, because, of course, you know, any return should be safe and also voluntary. So for those people who kind of aren't able to return, we are providing kind of humanitarian aid. There's a particular focus on women and girls, given the majority of the population in those camps are women, and on supporting their kind of health and protection needs. So kind of that's what we're doing as the UK.
Okay, Quentin.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Very much like Carla mentioned, I think this goes back to what our effort is in the fight against Daesh, and also our humanitarian action in Syria. We are active in, obviously, the military aspect of the coalition's activities, but also all other lines of effort, including, of course, the stabilization of the areas that have been liberated from Daesh. And then we have quite a massive effort in terms of stabilization in those regions through NGOs, multilateral organizations who implement a wide series of projects. And within this effort of stabilization, support to IDP, internally displaced population camps is one of our top humanitarian priorities in the area. We have, because the needs are so diverse in those facilities, we try to implement programs that cover all sectors, all fields of the needs, and this multi-pronged approach is really what we think is most needed for the vulnerable populations there. So we do a lot, for instance, on basic health services, access to health and medical facilities, on food security. Maybe we'll talk about this again, but an increasing challenge, education, hygiene, and other first first needs on this. And then to go to the repatriation aspects of your question. Since 2019, we've been conducting repatriation of minors who are in dire situation. We've had 5 of these operations. The latest, just on the July 5th, brought back 35 children, as well as 16 mothers. As always, these are driven by the humanitarian situation of those persons, which is of course incredibly fragile. But of course, there is also a security element which goes back to the growing instability in those facilities and in the region.
And just to introduce, what happened to those people when they returned to France?
So the 35 children are taken care of by the social services with a special program. Of course, you can imagine what some of them have been through. So we have devoted elements for this. The adults, so in that case, the 16 mothers were brought to, were arrested and detained because they were being charged in France under French law. And so they will be brought to justice under our legal system.
Great. Conrad, why don't you tell us a little bit about what the German government's doing?
Yeah, right. I'd love to. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's good to see you all. So yeah, I think I can easily add on to this. So for us as well, the detainee situation has been very much at the center of our efforts. Obviously, it's been a focus of our stabilization work. As you might know, Germany is one of the co-chairs of the stabilization working group within the international coalition. We've been one of the main donors to Syrians and to the international efforts to defeat ISIS. We've been specifically the second largest donors. We spent over 11 billion euros since 2012 to support Syrians and to support the neighboring countries. And we've been really working on integrating the improvement of the detainee situation into these lines of efforts. There are projects within the stabilization efforts to improve security and living conditions in the detainee centers themselves. And we've been, over the last year, developing efforts to support local authorities, specifically in Iraq, with reintegration and de-radicalization efforts. We've been making an effort to coordinate with donors, among them obviously Great Britain and France. We're focusing on these de-radicalization efforts. And yes, obviously another aspect of this, as the two of them already mentioned, is repatriations. We've also already had 5 repatriation operations of German nationals. We've repatriated, I think, a total of 69 children and 22 mothers. The last such operation was in March, and with this last operation, the very vast majority of mothers that are willing to leave the camps and to come back to Germany have been repatriated. So there are very few remaining cases that require more complex and individual solutions, which we're working on also with the support of the US, who have been in the previous operations a great partner in the logistical aspect of things. But yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, before we move on to some larger questions about the situation in Iraq and Syria and the Islamic State, I just want to push you all a little bit more on the repatriation question and use my prerogative as a journalist to maybe try to make a little bit of news here. So, as we know, the largest share of the population, as I think one of you said, is Iraqi and Syrian, but the US government has been making the case publicly for a long time that, that all countries involved need to take greater responsibility and repatriate their citizens. Can you give us an idea of how many of your country's nationals remain in the prisons and the camps, or if you can't, just some sort of ballpark estimate of how many European nationals remain there? I think it's hard to, in that transatlantic conversation, to get an idea of how much direct responsibility the European partners have without an idea of the share. Any of you?
Sorry, it's a good question, but I mean, I don't have any numbers to share, but I think sort of Charles might have mentioned earlier, you know, the population of Al-Hol is about 60,000, right?
Mm.
You've got 27,000 Iraqis, I'm looking at Charles to nod at me, 19,000 Syrians, and then 12,000 third country nationals. And again, if you look at the profiles of the people who went to join the Islamic State, yes, there were kind of Europeans, there were Americans, but there were also actually a lot from kind of the Arab nations,
Right.
from countries in the kind of wider Middle East. And I think that speaks to the fact that this is a kind of global problem, it's a kind of regional problem for the Middle East, and it's one where, yes, it's kind of something that we as Europeans are kind of working very hard on, but that's by no means the kind of majority or the whole story.
And how do you balance the desire to shut these population centers down and, you know, and deal with the security risks that there for the individuals and for the countries with, you know, the problems with sending people back to certain countries? If, I mean, setting aside Iraq and Syria, you know, you think of a country like Tunisia, where, you know, you have concerns about rule of law, but also political stability. Any thoughts about that?
I mean, I think our policy on all of that, right, has been that returns have got to be kind of safe and voluntary. And obviously, you know, there are a lot of countries across the Middle East that are in conflict right now, or for other reasons where it wouldn't be safe for individuals to return. Also, there are some individuals who are kind of in these camps who don't want to return to their countries because they're concerned about kind of what would happen to them. So, you know, that's why we're also looking at, yes, there's this discussion that we need to have about repatriations and about returns to countries in the region, but there's also this kind of humanitarian stabilization and recovery conversation about what do you do with these people who can't or won't return?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Carla said. Ultimately, there's a matter of what the individual will of the people who are in this situation is. And then you also have to look at what are the humanitarian circumstances in which they are, right? Because we're talking about this in broad, with a broad brush, if I can say so, but then you have to look at what is the exact situation of, especially when you're looking at mothers, children, what are their medical situation, what is their family situation, what kind of links do they have to maybe the country that they are in now. So I think all of this makes it difficult to have, you know, a one size fits all approach.
Sure, and it's obviously tied up with the larger situation in Iraq and Syria. Speaking of which, we had news yesterday from the United Nations that there was a 6-month extension of the cross-border aid mission into Syria, short of what the United States and its allies wanted, but perhaps the most possible at this moment, given Russia's position. And I think that begs the question, and I would love any of you to weigh in on this, is how do you see the war in Ukraine, which has certainly been dominating the headlines for the last 6 months, altering or shaping Russia's stance in Syria and the trajectory of the situation in Syria?
I'm happy to make a start. I mean, I won't surprise you if I say it's made things a lot more complicated. The negotiations over the last weeks in New York just being one example. Obviously, this is not, I mean, we're happy with the prolongation or the renewal of the resolution, but we're obviously looking at a very difficult situation this winter. It's not the solution we were hoping for, and I think it is really imperative now to heighten the pressure on Russia within the United Nations, engaging partners and allies in New York that have been sitting on the fence or have been concerned about the quality of their relations with Russia. And I think this is something where we should use more of our leverage to ensure that we can make progress in this field. I think they're, with the general picture of their involvement in the conflict, they're definitely there to stay. We're not seeing any significant drawback of troops or anything like that. Actually, in some parts, we're seeing increased activity, for example, in central Syria by the Russians. We know that this is a strategic project for them, with their military bases, a strategic hub for operations in the wider region. So they're definitely not willing to give this up. And if they give up territory and space, they're very willing to cooperate with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and other Iranian proxies. So this is definitely something we're very concerned about and keeping an eye on. The way Russia is assuming its role in Syria right now tells us that as long as they keep doing it this way, there's not going to be stability in the region. This is going to be a problem for Europe. So yeah, I think we need to keep up our own stabilization efforts, our own military efforts to defeat ISIS and ramp up diplomatic pressure on Russia.
Yeah, just to add a couple of points on this, the links between these two matters, Ukraine and Syria. First, the food security situation, right? Obviously, the war waged by Russia against Ukraine has had this impact that we've seen on food security, and in Syria, and in particular in areas in northeast, where the situation is already very dire. There's a real risk that this could lead to even more dramatic humanitarian consequences. The other mention that I would make is we've seen some of the same brutal tactics in Ukraine, in Syria, and we have the same responsibility there to not let these go with an impunity, to document the crimes, the atrocities that have been committed, and make sure that people are held accountable for what they've done.
Well, there actually have been a lot of unfavorable comparisons between the global justice response in Ukraine and what's happened in Syria. The fact that there's already an ICC investigation of what's going on in Ukraine and like real global international efforts to document there, with the lack of progress on Syria. How do you all see that?
Well, I mean, if we just take, cross-border first, I think it's quite striking that Russia was completely isolated, right, and vetoing a 12-month extension, which is what we wanted, which was what the pen holders wanted, which would have given the Syrians a bit more stability. And I think that really speaks to kind of Russia's position on the global stage. Then in terms of kind of justice and accountability, I think there are important differences, obviously, between the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Syria. If you're talking about referral to the ICC, Syria is not going to refer itself to the ICC. The UN Security Council has tried to refer the situation in Syria to the ICC numerous times, and of course, Russia has vetoed it every single time, which again really speaks to Russia's kind of approach to this conflict. But we have been seeking to hold Russia to account for what it's doing in Syria, as well as obviously hold the regime and its other backers like Iran to account. So, for example, last month, we announced a new package of sanctions on Russian individuals and Russian companies who are active in Syria, which was intended as sending a message about accountability and about their support for the Assad regime. Then, of course, we also support kind of what UN efforts do exist, most notably that kind of IIIM, to hold the Assad regime to account, but recognizing that this is probably going to be a longer term process where there's no quick solution because of the difficult international environment.
So do you all agree with Conrad that there's no hope that the squeeze that Russia is feeling on its military resources and the sanctions, do you agree that that will not have any impact on its presence and activities in Syria?
I think it's really hard to speculate on that point, right? In terms of Ukraine, one of the aims of our sanctions is to kind of weaken the Russia war machine.
Yeah.
So,
deny
them some of the things they need to fight their war. But, how that will play out in Syria, I think, 10 years ago, none of us would have predicted Syria would kind of turn out the way it did. There's obviously a lot of actors in play. It's not just about Russia, it's about Iran. It's about the kind of Assad regime that also has their own agenda. So I think, hard to say, except that sadly, the dire humanitarian situation and the suffering of the Syrian people is probably not going to end anytime soon.
And I guess it all depends on how the theaters evolve, right? What are the requirements? Is there at some point a strain on the resources that have to be allocated from one to another? So far, we haven't necessarily seen this. Might this change? Yes.
Okay.
If I might add to that quickly, I'm sorry. I think regarding to the criminal justice aspect, I think we see the same cynical game being played by Russia, the same as they play with humanitarian aid on the criminal justice issue, holding their hand over the Assad regime. So yeah, unfortunately, the way to the ICC is blocked for now, which would be the preferable way to deal with these issues. But there are avenues that we have been pursuing in Germany to bring regime members and also former fighters and supporters of Daesh to justice. And we're encouraging all allies to take similar paths. We have been employing the principle of universal jurisdiction in a number of cases in Germany. There have been, or I'm aware of at least 3 cases and 3 convictions of former members of the Assad regimes. We can pursue cases of crimes against humanity, genocide and war crimes. There's been a conviction of a married couple that had joined ISIS. And there's currently over 100 investigations pending in German courts for international crimes. Also, the federal prosecutor's office has been setting up special investigative units. The federal criminal police has been setting up special investigative units, and the courts, which are obviously operating independently, are really learning here from one another. So we're seeing really a number of very interesting cases. We cannot try people in absence, but we can very much prepare cases of crimes that have not been committed by Germans, not been committed in Germany, in absence of these individuals. And when we have reason to believe they will be traveling to Germany, then we can put them on trial.
Yeah, it's been really remarkable to see those cases will reach a conclusion. Let's talk about the Islamic State threat and how that's evolving. Yesterday, CENTCOM announced that there had been an operation killing the latest leader of ISIS, apparently in the Aleppo countryside. So I would love any assessment that you all could share about how big a threat now in 2022 the group really represents.
Well, I think it very much still is a threat, contrarily to what might be assumed sometimes, since Daesh, ISIS basically lost its territorial caliphates, so-called caliphates. I think there has been this assumption that it meant a defeat for the organization, and what we have seen is precisely the contrary. That is, the organization has proven resilient to its territorial defeat and is adapting, and we've seen surges of attacks here and there. Obviously, we're not in the same situation that we were in, 8 years ago. But the threat is very much real, and this is why I think all threats and all I believe the partners in the coalition have been making sure that they will remain committed to the fight against Daesh until it is defeated in an enduring way. What we have to see is that there is, of course, the Levant-based threat of Daesh, which is the main one, right, in Iraq, in Syria, for the local region. Then there is also the projected threats, especially for European countries and including in France, which very much remains one, where we have endogenous elements which could be activated or inspired or facilitated in conducting terrorist attacks. And this, we know, is still ongoing. So the threat remains high. I will just mention that because it was a very important moment for the French society that we've just concluded the trial of the November 2015 attacks. And that was obviously a very important, I think, moment for our memory of that event.
What does enduring defeat of the Islamic State threat really mean? I mean, given that what we saw in Iraq, for example, was a different kind of incarnation of militant currents that existed long before 2014, and it seems really feasible that this current, this movement, ideology, cells, whatever, continue to exist in those countries and in other countries indefinitely. If the thesis is that it's caused by different kinds of political and social factors, what does enduring defeat mean?
It's a really good question, right? And I think, obviously Daesh isn't holding territory anymore, but it is a very unusual thing for a terrorist organization to hold territory. The nature of terrorist organizations is that they tend to operate, as you would know, underground and kind of through cells. And I think, there's obviously been a change in the threat picture in Iraq. The coalition has changed to kind of an advise, assist, enable mission, supporting the Iraqi forces who are kind of in the lead in the in the fight against Daesh there. But I think, this question about propaganda is really important. We as the UK, we co-chair with the UAE and the US, the Counter-Daesh Coalition Strategic Communication Cells. And one of the purposes of that is to kind of counter Daesh propaganda. And I think you'll see that their propaganda looks really increasingly deluded now, right? Their leaders have been killed, they're no longer holding territory. It's becoming increasingly sort of detached from reality. And it's partly about kind of showing that, but it's also about giving an alternative message to, the populations who have been liberated from Daesh in Iraq and Syria, and talking about, the brighter future that's ahead and the alternatives that are open to them.
I want to go back to Syria. It's been interesting to compare from a journalistic perspective what our day-to-day focus was in 2015, 2014, 2016 versus now, where Ukraine's really dominated the headlines. And I think Syria as a frozen conflict is really receded from most Americans, day-to-day consciousness or thinking about the challenges that we need to be aware of in the world. I want to ask, how do you all see the rapprochement that has occurred between the Assad regime and some of the Arab governments? And the larger question is, given this kind of static control of territory, more or less, that we've seen in recent years, how do you see the situation in Syria evolving over the next 2 years? I mean, do you think it'll be the same in this, very volatile but somewhat tamped down situation that we see with all these different actors?
So, taking the first question about regional normalization with Assad, we don't think normalizing relations with the Assad regime, given what it's done, is the right way to kind of help the Syrian people or to achieve regional security. And we've, spoken to our partners about that. And we as the UK have been very clear, right, we're not going to consider any degree of normalization or reconstruction assistance until there's a credible, substantive and genuine political process underway. And kind of going further, we're concerned that sort of normalizing with the regime could actually kind of undermine that process, take away the incentives for the regime to engage seriously in a political process. Obviously, we realize that a lot of Syrians have kind of lost faith in this idea of kind of the international community supporting a political process, and that progress has been kind of painfully slow. I mean, how many rounds of the Constitutional Committee are we in now? But we still believe UNSCR 2254, which, the international community was able to come together and agree upon, is the kind of basis for a political solution in Syria. Do we see it happening in the next 2 years? It's what we're going to keep pressing for, what we're going to keep pushing for in Geneva and in capitals, but it hasn't been a quick process so far. Obviously, we're in a deeply volatile international environment, both in terms of Ukraine, but also in terms of food security, which kind of one of my colleagues mentioned earlier, and the tensions that's creating, the instability that's leading to in the Middle East, and which Russia, by the way, could address by letting the grain out of Ukraine. So I think, we'll continue to see kind of slow progress, a difficult humanitarian environment, and kind of further instability kind of as a result of the kind of enduring frozen conflict.
Quentin or Conrad?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Carla said. I think on the normalization bit, what would it change on this, on our political relation to the regime, lead to on the ground? Probably, certainly nothing. It has led to nothing so far. And it has just been pocketed by the regime as a way of rehabilitating itself. So France is very much in the same position. No reconstruction, no lifting of sanctions, no normalization until there is a political process under the auspices of the UN. I will also mention, as long as we have those incredibly gross and repeated massive human rights violations which go unpunished. I just wanted to pick up on something you mentioned before on the, the sort of, what is the perception today of Syria and the conflict, including in the US? I would say I believe it is still a bit different in Europe, at least speaking for France. Obviously, I just mentioned the trial of the 2015 attacks in Paris. And, the fact that driving from Raqqa to Paris is basically driving from LA to New York, right? It's the same distance. So the threat perception is a bit different when we're talking about combatants that are in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to repeat anything Carla and Quentin said, but I think it is really essential. I mean, those things are connected. If we want to eliminate the threat emanating from ISIS, we have to address these questions like ethnic tensions, like power vacuums in Iraq and in Syria, because this is the air they breathe. So, and this can only happen through a political process, and it is absolutely unacceptable. And I think we should really ask our partners if they're really getting what they expected out of these normalization steps. This is definitely what we're encouraging.
Just to play devil's advocate, though, you know, the idea articulated by the European governments and the United States has been that, you know, normalization would remove any incentive for, you know, the Assad regime to compromise in a political process or to engage meaningfully in a political process. But, you know, given that, is there any incentive for them to do so, even in the absence of larger normalization, when they continue to enjoy this, you know, crucial support from Iran and Russia? I mean, I guess to the bigger question of, you know, what can change, what will break this, what will shatter this frozen impasse, and at what point, you know, to challenge you all a little bit, you know, does this extended status quo with all the human suffering involved sort of end up being worse for the Syrian people and for the region? Just would love your thoughts, reflections on that. I know it's a really tough question.
Yeah, I think it is a really tough question. I mean, I think if you look at incentives, right, we've still got some, you know, really tough sanctions on the kind of Assad regime on individuals. So they cannot, for example, come to London and go shopping in Harrods and drive supercars around Knightsbridge, which is, you know, what you see a lot of people like that in the region kind of trying to do. So we have the kind of sanctions, we have the isolation of kind of Assad into the international stage. He's not been kind of readmitted to the Arab League. He's still a kind of a pariah internationally. And I think that does matter, and that is an incentive. In terms of kind of prolonging the suffering of the Syrian people, you know, we've always tried to create kind of humanitarian carve-outs for sanctions. But let's be real, Assad does not have the best needs of the Syrian people at heart. Sure. If you look at how kind of humanitarian aid is being distributed in regime-held areas, right, it is being politicized. It is being used to kind of reward supporters. The denial of aid is being used to punish kind of communities that had kind of supported the opposition. So, you know, we do not believe that kind of partnering with the Assad regime or kind of bringing Assad back into the fold is going to kind of make the situation inside Syria for Syrians kind of any better. And that's the sad truth.
Anyone?
I absolutely agree with this. I mean, it's the notion that there is you know, an arbitration to be made between normalization and support, humanitarian support to the population is absolutely wrong. I mean, we're the ones who have been mobilizing billions over years through all donors conference, who have been supporting the UN, NGOs, and all humanitarian actors in having access to the populations that are suffering from, you know, both the regime's war, of course, but also its stance and the stance of its supporters in preventing foreign actors from helping them.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like one of those situations where there's no good option, but it's also difficult to see what could change, you know, in the near term at least. Before we move on to Iraq, I just want to ask you about Turkey. You know, I think the figure I've seen is 3.7 million Syrian refugees, and then I certainly could see how that's a huge burden on the Turkish society and economy. Can you talk a little bit about the effort to send Syrians back into Syria from Turkey? How you all see that?
Yeah, I can try and make a start. I think it's the fact that they really took in that many Syrians for such a long time is really laudable. They've been a great factor creating stability for the region in that regard. Obviously, the conditions for return of the Syrians are not there yet. It's obviously has to be safe and voluntary. So we're engaging with the Turks and other partners on that dossier, but I think we're just not there yet. But I think it's also laudable the role that they've been playing in the cross-border resolution and in general in maintaining humanitarian support by the United Nations to Syria. So I think these are all facts that shouldn't be forgotten either.
Cool. Moving to Iraq, how do you all see the extended political instability in Iraq affecting the terrorism threat there and the potential for any sort of ISIS resurgence?
Tough question as well. But I think first, let's start from what the Iraqi government has accomplished over the last, few years, which is absolutely remarkable in terms of building their capacity to fight against Daesh, which has enabled the coalition to move to an assisting role with the Iraqi forces and the Iraqi government being there. Then they've been through an election process, which was, anything but guaranteed to be easy and smooth, and yet it went on, and as you know, the international observers validated the integrity of those elections. Now we are in this difficult situation. Obviously, we believe it is urgent that the government is constituted and that people are responsible. This democratic process is happening in Iraq now. We hope it will come to fruit as soon as possible, obviously.
Are you, go ahead.
I mean, we are worried that, the political situation in Iraq could kind of harm our kind of counter-Daesh efforts and the broader kind of stability of Iraq. And that's why, we want to see the kind of political leaders in Iraq kind of get around the table and kind of negotiate to form a government that's based on the outcomes of the election last year. But, I would say while that kind of political process in Iraq is going on, we continue to kind of work with both the Iraqi government in Baghdad, but also our kind of partners in the KRI as well, on the counter-Daesh campaign, on kind of helping stabilize areas that are liberated from Daesh, but also on kind of responding to COVID-19, kind of carrying out reforms, all the other kind of whole host of issues we've got to work on with the Iraqis. Yes, we want to see this fixed, but it isn't going to stop us kind of carrying on the bilateral agenda and the coalition work that we do with the Iraqis in the short term.
But have you seen any noticeable uptick that is concerning in ISIS activity that you would attribute to, the paralysis in Baghdad?
Yeah, I wouldn't say, we'd make that attribution at this stage, but obviously, the broader impact of the longer this goes on is something we continue to be concerned about.
Just last question before we open it up. And this is circling back to something we were just talking about a little while ago. How do you say there's been this remarkable transformation of the perception of the security situation in Europe, obviously expansion of NATO and a real significant commitment of new resources to NATO's Eastern Front and growing defense budgets for European countries. But do you all see these growing security burdens in Europe and the focus at all inhibiting the ability to continue the counter-ISIS operations, or is this just a marginal cost in comparison to what's happening in Europe?
I mean, I think, the Ukraine, kind of responding to the situation in Ukraine is obviously our kind of top foreign policy priority at the moment. It's been a huge focus for us. And I think it actually touches on every other issue. As you start to pull that thread, you start looking at kind of food security, what does the conflict mean? What does that mean for stability in the Middle East? What does kind of Russia's isolation mean for the kind of political efforts to solve these other problems? So I think, it is all connected. And I think the other thing is obviously, as we've been talking about, the threat from Daesh has changed, over the past kind of 5 years or so. We're not in a situation where we're fighting a large scale military campaign where they're holding territory and they're being pushed back. We are in a situation where we're kind of advising, assisting, enabling, kind of monitoring the threat and looking at what we can do, but that's not, that's not in the same terms of resources as what it was a few years ago.
Yeah, I could just build on what Quentin said earlier. This is really something that is very close to us and that we see the results of every day. I mean, we have close to 1 million Syrians in Germany, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. We have the largest Yazidi diaspora in the whole world with 200,000 in Germany. And they remind us every day that this is something that is going on right now that is still of relevance and that we need to take action on. And as they say here in America, you got to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Quentin, any other Americanisms to add?
No, I'm afraid it won't be as good as Conrad's. But yeah, we don't have a choice.
Okay.
We have to do both.
Okay, let's open it up to the audience if you want to raise your hand and just identify yourself before you ask the question.
Hi, my name is Armida. I'm a student at Dartmouth College working for Save the Children. And my question is, how do you navigate the fact that children are detained in these detention centers without any legal basis or any kind of legal basis like that? And the fact that a lot of international legal frameworks such as the UN Convention on Rights of the Child has been violated given the material conditions of the detention centers itself when you're going on these repatriation missions, meaning that we don't necessarily know the affiliations that these children and their mothers and their families have with ISIS themselves, because their detentions are quite arbitrary without any sense of legal basis.
Oh, tough question. Right. So, okay. I think firstly, about the Save the Children, we are hugely grateful for the work that Save the Children are doing, one of the few NGOs that's able to operate on the ground in northeast Syria. And we're really conscious that, operating inside camps such as Al-Hol puts humanitarian workers at significant risk. We saw a humanitarian worker killed, I think, kind of fairly recently. And so we were absolutely committed to kind of keeping that access going and creating a better security environment that protects humanitarian workers. On these questions about kind of children in detention, I think I would make a distinction between detention facilities and kind of Al-Hol, which, is a camp. Those are different, those conditions are different. And, I would point out that those camps are being run by the kind of local authorities in northeast Syria. They're not something that we as the coalition, as countries are in charge of. And we've always been clear that kind of those running detention facilities in Syria or elsewhere in the world should do so kind of in a way that is complies with international humanitarian law. That's what we want to see, but that's
just to challenge you on that. Do they have the capacity to do that though?
I mean, it's a good question, I can't, it's obviously an incredibly challenging environment for the kind of local authorities in northeast Syria, dealing with that population, and as best they can. And again, the SDF are kind of on the front lines. Some of the kind of YPJ members, right, have faced huge threats kind of going into those camps. So yeah, it is tough for them, but this is the conversation we have with them. We want to see it done in line with international humanitarian law.
No, I'll just add to your point that this is precisely what is driving our repatriation operations of minors. We want to subtract them to the circumstances in which they have to live there. You may call out a very useful distinction, I think, between detention and camps where people are located, and certainly children have rights both internationally and for French children under French law as well. So this is why we've been doing these operations. It's precisely to address this concern about the well-being of those children.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I want to make that point as well, because this is something that is really close to our hearts. It's really clear that we need to get those minors out of there. This is a very untenable situation, which is also why we repatriated most of German children from the camps back to Germany. There have been efforts to improve the conditions also in accordance with best practices from UNICEF and working together with local NGOs, and to also relocate children and prepare their reintegration to society, as we saw with the repatriation of Iraqi children just recently, which was really reassuring, and there will be more efforts.
How is the repatriation? How is the reintegration into society going when children are brought back to Germany? Anything you can share on that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, I don't have many details on that, and it really depends on the individual case. So if I think, as Quentin also said, many of the mothers will have to be trialed, and not all of them. So that really changes the situation for the children as well. Some are already have been captured as minors, but are not minors anymore. And then there's all the social services that are open to every other citizen as well, that are also open to these children, obviously.
Next question.
So mine actually follows quite nicely to the previous. So
Can you identify yourself?
I'm sorry. I'm Tammy Palacios. I'm building a non-state actors program with a sustainable focus at New Alliance Institute. We actually spoke with SDC Executive Committee President Ms. Ahmed yesterday, and she brought up obviously the concern over Turkish threat to incursion into Northeast Syria, but also the forced posture movement that's happening due to that from SDF being pulled from focusing on places like Al-Hol and the security to face that most recent threat. I was wondering if anyone would be willing to speak to either Europe's political or diplomatic intentions or on the ground support they could offer to kind of satisfy that gap and prevent an increased issue towards ISIS kind of swooping into this moment of security.
So yeah, absolutely. We don't want to see another Turkish incursion in northeast Syria. We think that would be destabilizing, and we're concerned about the very thing you were speaking about, right? That it is a distraction that takes away from the kind of vital task of providing security and pursuing the fight against Daesh. And we've had those conversations with the Turks. We continue to have them, and we have made clear kind of what I've said, that we recognise they have national security concerns, but we don't think another incursion into Syria would be kind of the right thing to do in terms of regional security and stability. And our shared goal, with Turkey, who is also a counterterrorism partner, of fighting Daesh.
It's exactly right. I think we share the same concern about this possibility, because we've seen that it from the past that it would have destabilizing circumstances, and as we've been discussing here, we already have an increasing instability, especially regarding the detainee situation. So this is obviously the last thing we need now, and this is a message that we're sharing, of course, with our Turkish partners.
All right, next question. I think there was a gentleman over there. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Alan Kieswetter, and I'm a scholar here at the Middle East Institute, and I worked for the Department of State for many years. Have any of your countries, either of the three of you, repatriated fighters? And what about rehabilitation and de-radicalization, which would be important, not only for the fighters, but in prison populations and in other groups that feed into these people that have gone off to fight for ISIS?
Go ahead. Sorry, and I'm hitting you in addition to that. Sorry. No, happy to take this one, because I think we've been precisely with the terrorist attack, trying to do a lot of work on radicalization. I won't go, because I'm not a scholar, into all the elaborate discussions about, can we really de-radicalize? Should we rather aim for disengagement from radical ideologies, or all of this? Key point being, we've had a series of de-radicalization strategies, or whatever the concept we use, including in prisons, because we know that these carceral environments are very much conducive to radicalization. This has led to a number of reforms in our system, creation of a jail intelligence service, separate quarters, but also the ability to follow detainees in French prisons that have been radicalized or gone through radicalization processes, both when they come into the prison throughout their stay in prison, but also when they go out. And I think this is something that leads to your question about what is the reintegration looking like. Then on the other question of fighters or other adults, I would say we haven't only done the repatriation that we've mentioned about, in the case of France, those 5 operations with children and most recently mothers. We've also done, in cooperation with our Turkish partners, a number of arrests that were done by Turkish authorities of people who were going or had been in northeastern Syria and were sent back to France to be tried. So we do have this experience. Then, and I think it goes back to what you were mentioning earlier, Konrad, on the rehabilitation and the radicalization. I think it would take years to understand if we have figured something that really makes sense, because it's going to be a very lengthy process if we have to put entire cohorts of people through it. I don't think we could say now that we know that we figured it out. We have the first feedback, and we're adjusting our programs, but I think we're still in the stage.
mean, I think on this question of radicalization, who has just walked into the room, but one of our leading British experts on kind of radicalization. So, you know, in answer to your question, I'd say, no, we haven't kind of brought back fighters from Syria. In terms of kind of rehabilitation, de-radicalization efforts, I'm sure Shiraz could give you chapter and verse on, you know, what works and what doesn't. It's something where we've been on a journey on the past 20 years, both domestically and overseas. You know, I would say in Syria, one of the things we are focused on is kind of humanitarian conditions. So basic things like healthcare, water, sanitation, kind of protection. And I think those are absolutely vital as a kind of baseline, right, to tackle people's immediate needs, you know, before perhaps you start having this broader conversation about kind of de-radicalization.
Next question. I think we got, we'll try to get in two more. So from Miles here, and then from right here in the third row.
Good morning, Miles Kaggins with the Council on Foreign Relations in United States Army. For the Global Coalition, I know in recent statements by the ministers in the ministerial, there was more emphasis on ISIS in West Africa. And I'm wondering if beyond the rhetoric, there's actual discussions in the military or communications or counter terrorism finance space to take action against ISIS in West Africa or other parts of Africa.
Also, you know, that's a good question, and part of my portfolio at the embassy does also cover Africa, although I should say it's not my area of expertise. So, you know, there are discussions going on within the coalition, kind of among members who are interested about what the coalition should be doing in Africa. You know, I'd make the point that the situation in West Africa is very different from Iraq and Syria. In Iraq and Syria, the coalition is obviously a military entity that kind of had forces on the ground. The situation in West Africa is different. You have a lot of kind of civilian-led efforts. So, you know, it's a conversation we're having, but we want to maintain the focus on the kind of the strategic threat posed by kind of Daesh core, so Iraq and Syria.
No, I think it's a discussion we've been having within the coalition, and that led to a number of progress at the Marrakesh ministerial that you were referring, with the establishment of, you know, a focus group on Africa, because the threat of Daesh has moved. But this leads the coalition. I mean, this is a different question for the coalition as it has been in the Levant, right? The core of our activities, because not only the environment is different and is slightly new for the coalition, but also there are other actors that are present. If you're looking at, you know, the Great Lakes region, if you're looking at Western Africa, we have a whole range of, you know, UN, multinational, national operations that have been going there. You also have very different settings of support on local governments that you can count on. And in some places it's easy, in some places it's impossible. In some places you already have locally owned initiatives there. So this is, I think, still an area in progress. I think there is a recognition that the threat of terrorism in Africa is increasing. I think that's the you know, the baseline of what this coalition effort means. But I think we are going back to our conversation about the enduring defeat of Daesh, very much willing to maintain the core focus of the coalition on the Levant.
I think we have time for just one more question. I think the woman in the third row.
I was wondering about the children under 12. One could probably infer that most of those children were born to ISIS fathers. Doesn't that complicate the issue when the women return to their native countries and the fathers want to claim the rights or some rights for the children?
I mean, it's a complicated question. You know, I would say in a lot of cases, the fathers are dead, right? Because Daesh suffered huge losses in the fight in Syria and Iraq. So, you know, we've had a lot of cases involving people who are orphans. Then, you know, again, the question of where the fathers are, right? Are they back in their home countries, or are they, as a lot of Daesh's remaining fighters are, in detention? And then, you know, when they do return, again, I think, you know, each country has its own kind of national laws and processes and kind of safeguarding approaches. that make decisions about, you know, what relationship it's appropriate for the father if they're there to have with the children.
Yeah, I agree. It is complicated. It's definitely been a concern, and which makes it in some individual cases, you always have to look in the individual case, very hard to repatriate minors to Germany. But I think we've found good solutions for the big majority of our own nationals underage in these camps. So I think with the support of our local partners and the US and other partners, I think I'm optimistic we can resolve those remaining cases as well.
Just a last final question to all. Do you all have an idea of the share of the people who are in the family camps? How many are minors? Anyone know?
I think it's about half in El Hol. And again, I looked to Charles, who is the repository of stats.
All right, listen, I don't think we have any time for anything more, although I'm sure we could continue this discussion all day. I want to thank Carla and Conrad and Quentin for taking the time today, and thank you all for being here, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank